What if the biggest mystery surrounding Solo was never his real name? What if the truth isn't that he's hiding from the world, but that he's still living inside the worst day of his life? Episode 9 gives us one of the most heartbreaking revelations in Silo so far. We finally learn that Solo is actually Jimmy Conroy, the son of Silo 17's IT shadow, Russell Conroy. For weeks, viewers have treated Solo as an unpredictable survivor who somehow managed to live alone for decades. But the episode quietly reveals something much more devastating. Jimmy isn't simply a man who survived a rebellion. He's a 12-year-old boy who never truly escaped it. Before we dive into this theory, if you enjoy breakdowns that go beyond simple recaps, consider subscribing. Every script on this channel is researched and written by me, and if you enjoy theories that connect hidden clues instead of chasing clickbait, sharing this video really helps it reach more Silo fans who love discussing these mysteries. The moment Juliet begins helping Jimmy recover his memories, the entire character changes. Up until now, it's easy to assume that Solo's strange behavior comes from decades of isolation. Living alone inside an abandoned silo would change anyone. But episode 9 gives us another explanation. Juliet realizes Jimmy was only 12 years old when everything fell apart. He wasn't the architect of Silo 17's destruction. He wasn't responsible for the rebellion. He wasn't even awake when the attack began. He was a frightened child who woke up to gunfire, confusion, and the horrifying sight of his father being executed after telling him to lock himself inside the vault. That detail changes everything. Notice what Russell Conroy actually tells his son. He doesn't ask Jimmy to save the silo. He doesn't tell him to protect the vault at all costs. He tells him to get inside and stay safe. For years, Jimmy has lived with crushing guilt, believing he failed everyone around him. But Juliet helps him see the truth. His father's final act wasn't about preserving a government or protecting secrets. It was about saving his son. That distinction transforms Solo from a mysterious survivor into something far more tragic. He isn't guarding the past because it was his mission. He's trapped inside it because he never emotionally left it. Steve Zahn captures this idea perfectly when he explains that Solo's world stopped. That's more than a description of isolation. It's a psychological truth. Everything Jimmy learned about trust, relationships, fear, and survival froze at the exact moment he watched his father die. His body grew older, but the emotional foundations that normally develop through friendships, family, and community never had the chance to form. Instead, he spent decades surrounded by books, old recordings, and memories that could never answer him back. That's why this theory isn't really about trauma alone. It's about time. Everyone else in Silo experiences time as something that moves forward. Jimmy experiences time as something that circles endlessly around one memory. Every day inside Silo 17 begins where his childhood ended. Every hallway reminds him of the people he lost. Every locked door reminds him of the order his father gave him. He survived physically, but emotionally, he remained locked inside that vault long after the rebellion was over. And that's exactly why Juliet is so important. She doesn't simply arrive to rescue Jimmy. She becomes the first person in decades capable of interrupting the cycle that has defined his entire existence. Juliet's arrival in Silo 17 doesn't simply introduce another survivor into Jimmy's isolated world. It introduces something he hasn't experienced since he was 12 years old. A person who challenges the story he's been telling himself for decades. That's what makes episode 9 so powerful. The biggest prison Jimmy has been living inside isn't the vault. And it isn't the abandoned silo. It's the guilt that has consumed him ever since his father's death. For years, he convinced himself that everyone died because of him. Every lonely day reinforced that belief, until it became the only version of history he could accept. But Juliet sees something Jimmy cannot. She sees a frightened child carrying the weight of an entire civilization's collapse, and she refuses to let him keep blaming himself. One small detail completely changes the meaning of Jimmy's past. Juliet notices the scar from the gunshot he suffered as a child and helps him piece together memories that trauma had buried. Suddenly, the story becomes clearer. Jimmy wasn't making impossible decisions during the rebellion. He wasn't choosing who lived or died. He wasn't leading anyone. He was asleep when the violence erupted. By the time he understood what was happening, his father had already made the decision that would define the rest of Jimmy's life. Russell Conroy didn't hand his son the responsibility of protecting Silo 17. He gave him one simple instruction: survive. That revelation transforms Russell into one of the most heartbreaking parents we've seen in Silo. In his final moments, he doesn't choose the system over his family. He chooses his child. Knowing there was no saving the people outside, Russell sacrifices everything to give Jimmy one chance to keep living. It's a decision built on love rather than duty, and that's exactly why Jimmy's misunderstanding has been so tragic. He spent decades believing he failed his father, when in reality he fulfilled the only request Russell ever made. Jimmy survived. But surviving isn't the same as living. Steve Zahn described Solo by saying his world stopped, and those words captured Jimmy's entire existence. Imagine spending decades repeating the same routines, speaking to no one, trusting no one, and carrying memories that never have the opportunity to heal. Human beings don't simply need food, water, and shelter to grow. We need conversations, disagreements, friendships, forgiveness, and hope. Jimmy had almost none of those things. Instead, he filled the silence with books, objects, and memories from a world that disappeared overnight. His emotional growth froze because nothing in his environment could move it forward. That's why Juliet's presence matters far beyond helping her escape Silo 17. She becomes the first person in decades to treat Jimmy as more than a ghost hiding behind a vault door. She listens. She questions his memories. Most importantly, she gives him permission to separate the facts from the guilt. Every conversation begins pulling Jimmy away from the version of himself that trauma created. The angry, suspicious man who once threatened to kill anyone approaching the vault slowly gives way to the frightened child who has finally found someone willing to understand him instead of fear him. The article quietly highlights another moment that carries enormous emotional weight. Jimmy eventually shows Juliet the survival suit that could allow her to leave Silo 17. On the surface, it's simply a practical decision, but symbolically, it's much more significant. For decades, Jimmy guarded everything inside that vault because it represented the only certainty left in his life. Allowing Juliet access means he's doing something he hasn't done since childhood. He's trusting another person. Think about how extraordinary that is. Trust isn't something Jimmy lost recently. It disappeared the moment he watched his father die. Every year after that reinforced the lesson that opening doors, believing people, or depending on others only leads to pain. Yet Juliet slowly breaks through those defenses, not by forcing Jimmy to change, but by helping him remember who he was before fear became his entire identity. She doesn't erase the trauma. She reminds him that his father's final act was never a judgment against him. It was an act of unconditional love. And perhaps that's the quiet message. Episode 9 has been building toward this all along. Healing doesn't begin when someone forgets the past. Healing begins when someone finally understands it correctly. Jimmy spent decades trapped inside a false memory of responsibility. Juliet replaces that lie with the truth, and the truth is far kinder than Jimmy ever allowed himself to believe. He wasn't abandoned. He was protected. He wasn't a failure. He was a child. And he didn't betray his father. He honored his father's last wish every single day he stayed alive. That realization doesn't instantly repair decades of emotional damage. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight. But for the first time since the fall of Silo 17, Jimmy's life begins moving forward instead of endlessly circling the worst day he ever lived through. In many ways, that's the real miracle of Episode 9. It isn't that Juliet found another survivor. It's that she found someone whose emotional clock stopped decades ago and quietly helped it start ticking again. But perhaps the most heartbreaking realization is that Jimmy didn't just lose his father that day. He lost his future. Most children grow into adulthood through countless ordinary moments. Conversations around the dinner table, arguments with friends, lessons learned from failure, and the comfort of knowing someone will always be there when things fall apart. Jimmy was robbed of every single one of those experiences. Instead of learning how to become an adult, he learned only how to survive. Every day inside Silo 17 became another repetition of the same lonely routine, reinforcing the belief that the outside world no longer existed for him. That's why Steve Zahn's description of Solo feels so devastatingly accurate. His world didn't simply become smaller, it stopped moving altogether. Time continued for everyone else, but for Jimmy, the clock froze the moment his father closed that vault door. The years passed, yet emotionally he remained trapped in the final moments of his childhood. carrying a grief no child should ever have to bear alone. This also changes the way we should view Juliet's role in Silo 17. She doesn't arrive as a hero who rescues a broken man. She arrives as the first living reminder that humanity still exists beyond Jimmy's memories. Every conversation they share slowly chips away at decades of isolation, replacing fear with trust and guilt with understanding. That's why Jimmy eventually chooses to help her instead of hiding forever. For the first time since the rebellion, he has someone willing to see him as Jimmy Conroy instead of the mysterious figure known only as Solo. In many ways, Juliet doesn't just reopen the vault, she reopens the part of Jimmy that had been locked away for decades. His willingness to trust her is more than character development. It's proof that healing begins the moment someone reminds us we are more than the worst thing that ever happened to us. And that may be the quiet message the writers wanted us to discover beneath all the mystery surrounding Silo 17. Survival has always been the central theme of Silo, but Episode 9 suggests that surviving isn't enough if a person is forced to abandon who they once were. Jimmy stayed alive because his father loved him enough to make the ultimate sacrifice, but staying alive came at an unimaginable emotional cost. Juliet helps him understand that surviving was never something he should feel guilty about. It was the final gift his father gave him. And perhaps that's why Solo's story resonates so deeply. It's not simply the story of the last survivor of Silo 17. It's the story of a frightened 12-year-old boy who spent decades waiting for time to start moving again, only to discover that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to tell you that none of what happened was ever your fault.